My mother's tears were a masterclass in manipulation. She begged me to come home, swearing my father was taking his final breath. But after 3 days of hell on a cruise ship, the door didn't open to a hospital bed. It opened to a golf club and a diaper bag. "Watch the kids," she said. "We're going on a family trip." They thought Engle Miller was their permanent safety net, but they forgot I'm a litigator who specializes in the destruction of liars. What I did next didn't just ruin Christmas, it dismantled their entire lives until the only thing left was the sound of their own screams. But the fire didn't start at the door. It started with a cold wind and a white-knuckled grip on a railing. The balcony of my suite on the Star of the Gulf should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like a gilded cage. I stood there, Engle, the senior litigator who had spent 20 years carving a name for myself in the glass towers of Houston, gripping the cold mahogany railing until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. Below, the dark, churning waters of the Gulf of Mexico swallowed the moonlight in greedy gulps. The waves were restless, mirroring the unpredictable depths of the family secrets I had tried so hard to outrun. I've spent my life defending the truth in courtrooms where logic is king, yet I stood there realizing that the truth within my own bloodline was the only case I could never seem to win. People often say that success is the best revenge, but as the salt spray hit my face, I knew better. True power isn't about how much you can control. It's about how much you can endure before you finally break. Looking back now, I should have seen the cracks in the foundation long ago. But we all want to believe in the sanctuary of home, don't we? Have you ever built a life of steel, reinforced by hard work and late nights, only to find it melting under the heat of a single phone call? It's a terrifying thing to realize that the people you call family don't value you for who you are, but only for the storms you can quiet with your checkbook. We often mistake loyalty for love, and that is a debt that never truly gets settled. I stood there, a woman who had everything, feeling more erased than I did when I started with nothing. The silence of the ocean was shattered by the sharp, persistent trill of my phone. It was Leanne, my mother. I watched her name flash on the screen, a digital ghost haunting my only vacation in 5 years. I had ignored the first 12 calls, but the 13th came as a FaceTime request. When I finally swiped to answer, the screen didn't show the festive decorations of our family home. It showed my mother's face, distorted by a mask of primal, hysterical grief. "Engelbertha, please!" she shrieked, her voice cracking like dry glass. Behind her, I saw a framed photograph of my grandmother on the hallway table. My anchor of hope. The only woman who ever loved me without a price tag. The sight of it made my chest tighten. Leanne wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking past it as if she were witnessing an execution. "It's your father. It's Dylan. His heart. Engle, the doctors say he's failing." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My father, Dylan, the man who was too stubborn to ever admit a weakness, was in the ICU. Leanne's sobbing intensified, a sound so raw it felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. "He's calling for you, Engle. He keeps asking for his baby girl. The doctors say he doesn't have days left, he has hours. Please, I'm begging you. Don't let him die thinking you chose a cruise ship over his final breath." In that moment, the lawyer in me should have asked for the name of the hospital. I should have asked to speak to a cardiologist. But the daughter in me, the little girl who still remembered him holding her hand at the Galveston Pier 30 years ago, completely took over. I felt a surge of desperate, sacrificial devotion. To love is to be vulnerable, and even if there was a tiny, cynical voice in the back of my head whispering that this felt too convenient, I pushed it down. I would rather be a fool for love than a master of indifference. I immediately hung up and dialed Silas, my oldest friend and a trusted legal colleague in Houston. My voice was a clipped, professional staccato, even as my hands trembled. "Silas, I need a car at the Galveston Pier the moment we dock. Check the medical registries for Engle Miller. My mother says he's in the ICU. Find out which one. I need travel restrictions lifted and an emergency berth." The reality of being at sea hit me like a physical blow. There were no flights, no fast exits, just the agonizingly slow pace of the massive ship as it churned toward the Texas coast. I began packing my bags with frantic, rhythmic movements. I folded my silk dresses and stowed my legal files, my mind already pivoting toward the worst-case scenario regarding Dylan's estate. I wasn't just a grieving daughter. I was the only person who could handle the legal fallout of his passing. The night turned treacherous as we neared the coast. A late December storm rolled in, rain streaking the suite's windows like cold, heavy tears. I stood on the deck one last time, watching the distant, flickering lights of the Texas shoreline. I had canceled my piece to return to a house that usually felt more like a courtroom than a home. I thought about the words of a wise man I once read. The greatest test of our character isn't how we treat those who are kind to us, but how we honor our own integrity when facing those who are not. I didn't realize it then, but that moment of resolve was the last bit of peace I would have for a long time. My loyalty was being weaponized against me, and I was walking straight into the mouth of the beast. I had spent years being the fixer, the one who opened her banking app every time a bill was overdue or a credit card was declined. I thought I was buying their love. I was actually just funding my own disappearance. As the ship finally groaned against the dock at Galveston, the humidity of the Gulf air felt like a damp shroud. I gripped the handle of my suitcase, the metal cold and unyielding against my palm. A text message vibrated against my thigh. It was from Leanne. It was short, devoid of the hysteria from an hour ago. "Hurry! The door is unlocked. We're waiting." Something about the word waiting sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter rain. It felt less like a vigil and more like a trap. I stepped off the gangway and into the waiting car, my heart hammering against my ribs like a bird in a cage. I was rushing toward a home I thought I could save, unaware that the people inside had already decided I was the only thing they were willing to sacrifice. That's where it all started. The car tires crunched over the pristine white gravel of the driveway in the woodlands. I stepped out, my legs still vibrating from the phantom motion of the sea, clutching gift bags for nieces who barely knew my face. The colonial-style mansion loomed over me, draped in thousands of dollars of LED lights that pulsed like a shallow heartbeat. It was a picture of suburban perfection, a curated facade of warmth that I knew was built on the cold foundation of my own labor. I rushed to the front door, my breath hitching in my chest, still foolishly expecting to find a house in mourning. Instead, the heavy oak door swung open to reveal a scene that froze the blood in my veins. Dylan stood there, tall and robust, wearing a cashmere vest I had bought him for his birthday. He wasn't in an ICU bed. He was holding a titanium driver, mid-swing practice in the foyer. Behind him stood Leanne, her eyes dry and her expression one of mild annoyance. There was no medical equipment, no scent of antiseptic, only the smell of expensive pine candles and the smug satisfaction of a successful trap. "Engelbertha, you're late," Leanne said, bypassing any greeting as she shoved a heavy diaper bag into my chest. Her voice lacked even a tremor of the hysteria that had pulled me across the ocean. Callista sashayed into the hall, checking her diamond-encrusted watch and adjusting the strap of her designer carry-on. "Thank God you're finally here," Leanne continued. "Callista is exhausted and needs a real break, and we've already paid for the Aspen VIP package. Don't give me that lawyer look, Engle. It's Christmas, and for once you can do something for this family." I didn't scream, though the silence in my throat felt like a physical weight. I looked at my father's healthy, ruddy face and felt a strange, hollow relief that he wasn't dying, even as the sting of the lie burned through my soul. I realized then that forgiveness isn't about letting people off the hook for their cruelty. It's about refusing to let their bitterness take up residence in your own heart. I stood there, a senior litigator who had argued before the highest courts, reduced to an unpaid nanny in the span of 30 seconds. Looking back now, I should have seen the calculated coldness in their eyes. The family piled into the oversized SUV, the one for which I still paid the monthly installments. Callista didn't even look back as she buckled her seatbelt, her voice drifting through the open window with a sharp, entitled edge. "Make sure the kids eat organic, Engle! And don't touch the vintage wine in the cellar. That's for our New Year's party." The engine roared to life, and I watched the taillights fade into the Texas twilight, leaving me alone on the porch with 2 sleeping toddlers. I turned to go back inside to retrieve my laptop from the car, but as I reached for the handle, a metallic click echoed through the quiet evening. I pulled, but the door remained immobile. Dylan had used the administrative override on the smart home system to lock every exit from his phone the moment they cleared the gates. I was trapped. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a high-tech cage. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a notification appearing that made my stomach turn. My location services were being pinged by a banking app registered to my father's device. He was using my physical presence in the house to bypass the home location security checks for a massive wire transfer he was attempting to authorize in my name. In their eyes, I wasn't a daughter or even a sister. I was a utility, a human security token to be used and discarded. When people treat you like an option, you have to remind yourself that you are actually the foundation they are standing on. And foundations have a way of moving when the weight becomes too much to bear. I didn't realize it then, but my silence wasn't submission. It was the quiet before a landslide. I walked through the darkened house, the shadows stretching across the marble floors like long, accusing fingers. The remnants of their pre-trip celebration were everywhere. Empty champagne bottles, crumpled wrapping paper, and the expensive trash of people who never had to count the cost. I went upstairs and checked on the children, tucking them into their beds with a genuine gentleness that they had never learned from their own mother. I couldn't punish them for the sins of the people who raised them. I sat down at the kitchen island, the cold granite biting into my skin through my silk sleeves. I didn't have my laptop, but I had my mind, and I had 20 years of legal experience that Dylan had clearly underestimated. I began mentally mapping out the joint tenancy agreements and the power of attorney loopholes he thought he was using to bury me. A fence doesn't exist just to keep people out. It exists to show them where your soul begins and their entitlement ends. My loyalty hadn't been a virtue. It had been complicity in my own destruction. Have you ever looked at a door and realized the only way out was to burn the whole house down? Metaphorically speaking, sometimes the only way to find your voice is to stop answering the calls of those who only want to hear you say yes. I reached for the house phone to call Silas, but the line was dead. Dylan had activated the signal jammer he'd installed for privacy, cutting me off from the outside world entirely. He wanted me isolated, silenced, and compliant. I felt a surge of cold, analytical fury, the kind that wins cases and ruins reputations. I wasn't panicked, I was focused. As I looked at the children's tablets charging on the counter, I saw a flicker of light, a backdoor Wi-Fi connection they had neglected to secure in their haste to leave for Aspen. It was a small oversight, a tiny crack in their perfect plan. I gripped the edge of the counter, my heart finally finding a steady, dangerous rhythm. I watched the taillights of my own car disappear down the driveway, the metallic click of the front door echoing like a gavel in a courtroom where I had already been found guilty of being too kind. The metallic click of the front door was more than just a lock engaging. It was the sound of a daughter being officially discarded. I stood in the dark foyer of the mansion, listening to the hum of the high-tech security system Dylan had so proudly installed. He thought he had sequestered me, Engle the problem solver, into a corner where I would quietly mind the children while they lived out a fantasy on my dime. But he had forgotten one thing. A cage is only effective if the occupant doesn't know how the locks were built. I moved through the house like a ghost, my footsteps silent on the cold marble. I didn't need a laptop to fight back. I had the toddlers' tablets. Within minutes, I had established an encrypted tunnel through their unsecured Wi-Fi, bypassing Dylan's crude signal jammer. I reached his private study, the air thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and old lies. Using a thin plastic shim from my wallet, a trick I'd once used to demonstrate security flaws in a corporate espionage case, I bypassed the heavy oak door. I wasn't looking for an exit anymore. I was looking for the why. Inside Dylan's study, the silence was suffocating. I bypassed the obvious drawers and went straight for the row of law books that remained untouched by dust. Behind a leather-bound set of Blackstone's commentaries, I found the hidden floor safe. The code was simple, the birthday of the only person Dylan truly loved, himself. Inside sat a leather folder labeled Estate Planning. It wasn't a plan for the future. It was a ledger of my destruction. My hands remained steady as I pulled out the documents, but my heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold fist. I found a series of million-dollar bridge loans, high-interest contracts designed to prop up Callista's failed boutique hotel venture. My name, Engle Miller, was listed as the primary guarantor. I stared at the signature at the bottom. It was perfect, too perfect. It had been traced using a lightbox, a criminal forgery executed by the man who used to read me bedtime stories. The most dangerous lies aren't told by our enemies, but by those who know exactly how our hearts beat. They didn't just steal my credit score, they stole the version of me that believed family was a sanctuary. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the tablet illuminating the proof of my father's betrayal. I felt an analytical shock shifting into a cold, diamond-hard realization. Have you ever realized that the person you were willing to take a bullet for was the one holding the gun? It's a moment that changes your DNA. I wasn't just a daughter in this room. I was a forensic investigator at a crime scene. I reached for the small velvet box on the corner of the desk, the place where my grandmother's 3-carat diamond ring was always kept. It was my only sentimental inheritance, the one thing she told me to keep for a rainy day. The box was empty. In its place was a crumpled pawn ticket from a shop in Dallas, dated just 3 days ago. I pulled up the receipt for the Aspen VIP family package on the desk. The numbers matched down to the cent. Leanne hadn't begged me to come home because she missed me. She had sold the last physical memory of my grandmother to buy a first-class ticket away from the mess they'd made. A searing pain flared in my chest, but I channeled it into resolve. Love is a debt that never gets repaid, but kindness should never be used as a currency for someone else's greed. I whispered those words into the empty room, a promise to the woman who had actually raised me. I would get the ring back, but first, I had to dismantle the hands that had pawned it. Under Texas law, forgery in the first degree is a felony that carries a heavy price when it involves financial contracts. Dylan hadn't just built a cage, he had built his own prison cell. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I sat in Dylan's oversized leather chair, the one I had paid for 3 Christmases ago, and began the work. I used my phone to record a time-stamped, geo-located video statement. I documented every forged page, every pawn slip, and the reality of my imprisonment within the house. I was no longer the baby girl of the Miller family. I was a senior litigator preparing for the most important trial of my life, and the jury was already out. I heard a soft whimper from the nursery monitor. I paused, my legal mind softening for a brief second. I went into the children's room and found Mia tossing in her sleep. I sat by her bed and hummed the lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me. To protect these children from becoming like their mother, I had to break this cycle of toxicity now. Walking away isn't always an act of desertion. Sometimes, it's the only way to lead everyone else toward the truth. I tucked her in, my resolve only strengthening as I kissed her forehead. I returned to the study and hit send, uploading the entire cache of evidence to Silas's secure server. The progress bar crawled across the screen, a digital countdown to the end of the Miller family's facade. Just as the notification "Upload complete" flashed, a tiny red light on the wall began to pulse. It was a hidden camera, one I had missed in the shadows. Dylan was watching. Halfway across the country, he was seeing his safe daughter turn into his most lethal adversary. I looked directly into the lens and didn't blink. I closed the leather folder, the weight of the forgery feeling heavier than the mansion itself. By sunrise, the man who called me his daughter would realize that the safety net he had relied on for decades had finally turned into a noose. That's where it all changed. I didn't know what his next move would be, but I knew the game of happy family was officially over. I sat in Dylan's high-backed leather chair, staring directly into the tiny, unblinking red eye of the hidden camera. He was out there somewhere. Terminal C, a VIP lounge, or perhaps already in the air, watching his obedient daughter through a digital tether. He thought he had the luxury of distance, but he had forgotten that in the modern world, proximity is measured in bandwidth, not miles. I didn't flinch. I didn't hide. I simply pulled the toddler's tablet closer, using it as a secure hotspot to bypass the house's signal jammer and tunnel through to Silas. Silas's voice came through my earpiece, a low, rhythmic murmur that felt like a lifeline in the suffocating silence of the mansion. He had spent the last hour performing a forensic autopsy on the Aspen VIP package. "Engle, it's worse than we thought," he whispered, the sound of rapid keystrokes punctuating his words. "This isn't just a vacation. It's a clean-out. Dylan is moving the entire $1.2 million from that forged bridge loan into a spendthrift trust in Aspen. By the time they land, they'll be legally broke on paper, and the bank will be knocking on your door in Houston for the full balance." I watched the data stream across the tablet's cracked screen, a waterfall of numbers that represented the total erasure of my future. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching, but betrayal is doing the wrong thing while looking someone in the eye and calling them family. I realized then that I wasn't just their fixer or their bank. I was their legal sacrificial lamb, handpicked and fattened up by years of my own misguided loyalty. Looking back now, the architecture of their deception was so complete, it was almost beautiful in its cruelty. I glanced at a framed photo on the corner of the mahogany desk. It was Dylan, 20 years younger, holding a 5-year-old me at a carnival. He looked happy. I looked safe. For a fleeting, agonizing second, I wanted to reach out and delete the forensic files, to let them have their mountain retreat and their stolen peace. But then my gaze shifted to the empty velvet box of my grandmother's ring and the diaper bag Leanne had shoved into my chest. I thought of Callista's children, sleeping upstairs, being raised by people who viewed love as a transaction and children as leverage. "Silas," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's blade. "Justice without mercy is cruelty, but mercy without justice is complicity. I cannot save them from the consequences of their choices if I am drowning in the shadows they created." I chose to act, not out of a thirst for vengeance, but out of a desperate need to protect the only legacy that still mattered, my grandmother's memory and my own sanity. I wasn't being an ungrateful daughter. I was being the only responsible adult in a room full of emotional vandals. Under Texas law, the ex parte temporary restraining order is a powerful tool when there is clear evidence of irreparable harm. I began drafting the emergency injunction, my fingers moving across the screen with a cold, cinematic precision. I listed every forged signature, every unauthorized ping of my location services, and the specific intent of the Spendthrift Trust. I wasn't just filing a lawsuit. I was setting a boundary that should have been built with stones decades ago. Sometimes, the only way to find peace is to build a wall high enough that the chaos can no longer reach you. The clock on the study wall ticked toward midnight. I didn't call Leanne to plead. I didn't text Callista to warn her. I had spent 45 years being the girl who explained, who apologized, who mitigated. That version of Engle was dead, buried under a mountain of pawn tickets and forged bridge loans. With a single final tap of the submit button, I sent the e-filing to the Harris County Clerk's office. Then I triggered the secondary command Silas had prepared, the immediate revocation of authorized user status on all 14 credit accounts tied to my social security number. The digital decapitation was instantaneous. On my monitor, I watched as the approved statuses on the family's shared digital wallets turned to a stark, blood red, account restricted. I shut down the funding for the private jet, the Aspen Lodge, and the offshore wire transfer. I was effectively cutting the oxygen to their financial fraud before the ink could even dry on their new trust. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, expectant quiet that signaled the end of an era. I closed the tablet and walked out of the study, leaving the red light of the camera to watch an empty chair. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, my hands perfectly still for the first time in days. It was officially Christmas Day. For the first time in my life, the only person I owed a single thing to was the woman staring back at me in the reflection of the dark window. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like a survivor who had finally reached the shore. Suddenly, the house phone, the landline I thought Dylan had disabled, began to ring. The caller ID glowed with a location that made my pulse quicken. Houston Intercontinental Airport, Terminal C. The first card had been declined at the VIP check-in, and the dream of Aspen was about to collide with the reality of the law. I stood in the center of the dark kitchen, the silence of the mansion feeling like the breath before a scream, knowing that halfway across the city, the cards I had just killed were about to expose the truth. I stood in the center of the dark kitchen, the silence of the mansion feeling like the breath before a scream, knowing that halfway across the city, the cards I had just killed were about to expose the truth. The humming of the refrigerator was the only witness to my quiet rebellion. My fingers traced the cold granite of the island, a surface I had paid for but never truly felt invited to sit at. For decades, I had been the silent architect of their comfort, but tonight, I had pulled the cornerstone from their foundation. I didn't feel like a victor yet. I felt like a soldier waiting for the first wave of a long-delayed war. The silence didn't last long. The house phone, a landline Dylan kept for emergencies, screamed into the stillness, the sound vibrating against the oak cabinets. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the receiver, my heart hammering a rhythmic, steady cadence. Callista's voice arrived first, raw and jagged with the humiliation of being turned away from the VIP check-in at Terminal C. I could almost see her standing there, surrounded by the designer luggage I had funded, her face flushed with the kind of rage only the entitled can manifest. "Engle Bertha, what have you done?" she shrieked, the sound of airport announcements echoing in the background. Before I could answer, Dellen's voice cut in, a low, dangerous growl that I recognized from the few times he had been truly crossed. He wasn't the dying man Leanne had described. He was a predator who had just realized his prey had teeth. "You think this is a game, Engle? You're in my house, looking at my things, and you think you have the right to lock us out of our own accounts? That's elder abuse. That's theft of family opportunity. I'll have the Houston police at that door in 10 minutes for breaking and entering." I leaned against the kitchen counter, the dial tone still humming in my ear like a threat, knowing that my family had just fired their loudest shot. Dellen's attempt to seize the moral high ground was a move I had seen 1,000 times in court, the desperate play of a guilty man trying to distract from his own crimes. He claimed my actions tonight would haunt my professional reputation, that I was destroying the Miller name. Looking back now, I should have realized that a cornered animal always goes for the throat. Callista's voice cut back in, dropping the ultimate threat with a chilling, calculated calm. "You think you're so smart with your silent execution, Engle? You think your law firm won't care?" She let out a short, sharp laugh that made my skin crawl. "I've already sent a leak to your partners. Documents that suggest you've been embezzling client funds to pay for that fancy flat in London. It's a frame-up, little sister, using every single wire transfer you ever sent us to save the house. By 8 a.m., the Texas Bar Association will have enough evidence to disbar you forever. Open the accounts, now." I felt the floor drop away from my feet. My career, the only thing I had built for myself, my only shield and identity, was under a coordinated, malicious fire. The very kindness I had shown them, the money I had sent to keep the lights on and the mortgage paid, was being twisted into a noose for my own neck. It was a psychological trap designed to make me break. Have you ever realized that the person who knows your greatest strengths is also the one best equipped to destroy them? It's a visceral, sickening dread that leaves you breathless. I closed my eyes and drew a long, slow breath, forcing the panic back into the box I had built for it. I remembered my grandmother's voice, a soft whisper from a memory of a rain-slicked Houston afternoon. "A lie is a heavy stone, Engle. It might sink deep, but the truth is the water that eventually wears it away." I realized in that moment that I wasn't fighting for money or even for a house anymore. I was fighting for the truth of my own existence. If I gave in now, I wouldn't just be poor. I would be theirs forever. "I'm not opening anything, Callista," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a final judgment. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue against the frame-up. To explain is to lose power in the face of a narcissist. The truth doesn't need a lawyer, and it certainly doesn't need your permission to exist. I hung up the phone before they could respond, the silence of the kitchen returning, heavier and colder than before. I wasn't fighting a defensive war anymore. I was ready to go on the offensive. I contacted Silas immediately through the encrypted tunnel. My directive was simple, but crazy, by any standard of family loyalty. "Don't just freeze the cards, Silas. I want to buy the debt. Contact the lender of that forged bridge loan right now. Use my liquidity and my credit standing to offer a full buyout of the distressed asset. I want to move from being the guarantor to being the primary creditor." I was leveraging U.S. financial law to flip the script. I would no longer be the victim of Dellen's forgery. I would become his landlord and his banker. It was a strategic evolution, a restructuring of the Miller family dynamic. In the eyes of the law, Dellen wasn't my father anymore. He was a debtor in default to my LLC. This wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing a reality they could no longer manipulate. I was moving the chess pieces while they were still screaming at the airport staff. Looking back now, I realized that the only way to truly leave a toxic room is to own the door. I walked into the living room, the darkness broken only by the flickering streetlights outside. I reached out and plugged in the Christmas tree. The lights flared to life, gold, red, and silver ornaments reflecting in the glass like a commander's map. I sat on the edge of the sofa, the same sofa Callista had claimed was too cheap for her taste, and watched the blinking lights. You wanted me to be your safety net, I thought. Now, you'll have to learn what it's like to walk on a tightrope without one. A new notification appeared on my tablet, a flicker of movement on the airport's public security feed that Silas had accessed. I saw Dylan and Leanne being questioned by airport police, their faces masks of shock and indignation. But my eyes were drawn to Callista. She was slipping away from the chaos, her carry-on in hand, meeting a mystery man by the boarding gate. She was abandoning her own parents the second the money dried up, a rat fleeing a ship she had helped sink. I leaned back, the fire of a warrior's resolve settling into a cold, steady glow in my chest. I had spent my life trying to be the good daughter, the one who sacrificed her peace for their comfort. That girl died at 12:15 a.m. on Christmas Day. The woman who replaced her didn't need their approval to be whole. Sitting in the soft light of the trees, I knew that the battlefield had changed forever. They had fired their loudest shot, but I was the one who still held the ground. The red and gold lights of the Christmas tree pulsed steadily, a rhythmic reassurance that I was no longer drifting. I had dropped the anchor of my resolve, and no amount of family storm could move me. I wasn't panicking, I was preparing. At George Bush Intercontinental Airport, the air was sterile and cold, humming with the frantic energy of delayed travelers and festive reunions. But in Terminal C, the festive mood shattered. I watched through the tablet screen as Silas fed me the security patch from the VIP lounge. Dylan and Leanne were no longer surrounded by luxury. They were surrounded by 3 Houston airport police officers. Their family trip suitcases, bursting with clothes I had bought them, sat open and humiliated on the polished floor. The credit cards I had flagged as stolen were spread across the counter like cold plastic evidence. Dylan was shouting, his face a deep, dangerous shade of purple as he pointed a finger at the lead officer. "This is a mistake. My daughter is a senior litigator here in Houston. She authorized every single one of these accounts. Call Engle Miller right now." The officer didn't flinch. Instead, he took Dylan's seized phone and initiated the video call I had been waiting for. I didn't hide in the shadows. I adjusted my silk blouse and looked directly into the camera from the comfort of the mansion's study. "I'm Engelbertha," I said, my voice carrying the clinical, terrifying precision of a woman who had won $1,000,000 verdicts before breakfast. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Officer, I am the primary cardholder for every account in that man's possession. I have not authorized any travel, nor did I authorize the $1.2 million bridge loan he attempted to secure using my forged signature." I hit a key on my laptop, sending the forensic audit and the unauthorized wire transfer logs directly to the precinct's digital intake. Leanne's face appeared in the background, her carefully applied makeup smearing as she realized the Aspen dream was officially dead. She let out a raw, guttural scream that echoed through the terminal, a sound not of grief, but of pure, narcissistic rage. She screamed because her safety net had finally grown a spine. I watched her through the screen and felt a strange, detached pang of pity. The loudest screams usually come from those who realize they can no longer hide behind a lie they forced someone else to live. Callista made a desperate, final play. She lunged toward the camera, her eyes wide and manic. "She's an embezzler! She's been stealing from her firm to pay for her London life. Officer, she's the criminal." I didn't even blink. I had already BCC'd my firm's managing partners on the digital war room logs. I proved that every dollar I ever sent home was a documented gift from my taxed income, while the evidence Callista tried to plant was actually a digital trail of Dylan's own identity theft against me. Looking back now, I realize that the truth is a shield only for those who have the courage to hold it. Under the Electronic Signatures and Global and National Commerce Act, intent is the soul of the law. I explained to the officers and to my father that because I was locked inside the mansion without internet access, a fact verified by the smart lock logs Dylan himself had created, I could not have authorized those transfers. I had effectively turned his smart prison into the very cage that was now trapping him. When Dylan finally realized the law was no longer his tool, he slumped against the lounge chair, his ruddy face turning a sickly gray. "Engelbertha, please," he whispered, his voice trembling. Save the family honor. Don't do this to us." I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw the father who used to read stories to me. But then I saw the man who had pawned my grandmother's ring. "Father," I said, the words heavy in my throat. "A name is just a word. Integrity is the soul of that word. I'm not ruining our reputation. I'm making it meaningful again." I refused to lie for them, but I also refused to enjoy the sight of their ruin. Silas sent me a confirmation text 5 minutes later. The Houston District Attorney was opening a formal investigation into Dylan and Callista for financial fraud and forgery. The Aspen VIPs were left stranded at Terminal C without a cent to their names, their credit dead and their passports flagged. I could have left them there. I could have let them sleep on the airport floor. But I instructed Silas to pay for a simple Uber to bring my parents back to the mansion. I still cared for their basic safety, even if I no longer funded their greed. I walked out to the balcony of the mansion and looked at the cold, bright Texas stars. Have you ever realized that the person who saves you is usually the one you see in the mirror every morning? I remembered a philosophy about how you cannot change the people around you, but you can change the people you choose to be around. My unfilial act was actually the most loving thing I could have done. I had finally forced them to be adults in a world they had tried to manipulate for far too long. I went back inside and prepared for their arrival. I wasn't hiding in my room. I sat at the head of the long dining table, the pawn ticket for my grandmother's ring sitting on the lace runner in front of me. I had already wired the funds to the Dallas shop to have the ring returned by courier. I was the landlord now, sitting in a house I owned, waiting for the tenants who had forgotten how to be a family. Sometimes walking away is louder than any argument you could ever win. As the headlights swept across the lawn, I felt a strange, quiet peace settle into my chest. The Uber pulled into the driveway, and I realized Callista was not in the car. Leanne and Dylan stepped out, looking smaller and more defeated than I had ever seen them. But behind their car, a black SUV with tinted windows, one I didn't recognize, was following them slowly, its engine a low, predatory hum. The headlights swept across the lawn in a slow, tired arc, illuminating a scene that looked more like a roadside salvage yard than a high-end estate in the woodlands. I stood on the porch, Engle Bertha, no longer the daughter awaiting approval, but the woman holding the ledger of truth. The Houston humidity was thick, clinging to the air like the heavy silence that precedes a final judgment. As the Uber came to a rattling halt, the beams caught the surreal sight of the parents' designer luggage, Dylan's golf clubs, and Leanne's boutique shopping bags neatly stacked on the grass. It was a graveyard of their vanity, a physical manifestation of the debt they had tried to bury me under. The car doors opened with a heavy, metallic groan. Dylan and Leanne stumbled out, looking broken, their skin sallow under the harsh fluorescent glare of the porch light. Dylan tried to muster his old bluster, stepping onto the grass and pointing a trembling finger toward me. "Engle, what is this? This is my house. You have no right to touch our things." I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped forward and handed him the assignment of debt and the notice to vacate papers Silas had finalized an hour ago. Under Texas property code, the joint tenancy they had used to tether me was gone, severed by their own documented fraud and my subsequent buyout of the defaulted mortgage. "Dad, a home is a sanctuary built on trust," I said, my voice carrying a calmness that seemed to vibrate in the damp air. "When you forged my signature to gamble with our lives, you turned this sanctuary into a transaction, and transactions always have consequences." Dylan stared at the papers, his jaw dropping as the unexpected reality of the eviction lawsuit finally hit him. He was no longer the landlord. He was a tenant in breach of contract. I saw his shoulders slump, the golf club in his hand looking like a useless relic of a life he could no longer afford. Leanne was shivering, the damp night air cutting through her thin silk blouse. I looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the old urge to fix everything flared in my chest. Instead of reaching for my checkbook, I reached for a thick wool coat. One I had bought for her years ago, but she'd dismissed as too common. I draped it over her shoulders without a word. Setting a boundary is not an act of hate. It is an act of self-respect that finally invites others to be honest. I didn't feel joy in their defeat, only a heavy, necessary peace. I looked past them toward the gate, but the black SUV with the tinted windows I had noticed earlier didn't follow them in. Silas had already messaged me the truth. Callista wasn't in the Uber because she had never intended to return. She had arranged a private car using a secret emergency fund she'd hidden from our parents, the very money she claimed she didn't have for her own children's daycare. She had abandoned her mother and father at the airport the moment she realized the bank accounts were dead. The cycle of selfishness she had learned at their feet had finally come full circle, leaving them behind just as they had once left me. Leanne let out a quiet, broken sob, sinking onto one of the suitcases. She finally understood that her favorite child had used her just as ruthlessly as she had used me. I watched her and felt a deep, quiet sorrow for the decades I spent trying to earn a love that was always conditional. You cannot heal a person who uses their wounds as a weapon against you. In that moment, I realized that my survival didn't depend on their apology. It depended on my refusal to be their victim ever again. I leaned against the porch railing, looking down at the two people who had raised me to be a safety net. "I have filed for a restructuring of occupancy," I told them, my voice firm but devoid of malice. "I am not throwing you onto the streets. That would be beneath the character our grandmother raised me to have." I informed them that they could stay in the guest wing, but only under a strict tenancy-at-will agreement. They would undergo financial counseling, live on a budget I dictated, and contribute to the household maintenance they had spent years ignoring. I was reclaiming my home, not through force, but through a moral authority they could no longer deny. True forgiveness is not forgetting what happened. It is refusing to let the past control your future. I had spent 45 years being erased by their needs, but tonight, I was the one writing the new rules. Dylan looked at the house, then at the grass, and finally at me. For the first time, he didn't see a baby girl he could manipulate. He saw a woman he had to respect. They began quietly picking up their bags, no longer as masters of the mansion, but as residents in a world where the truth was the only currency that mattered. I walked back into the study, now my official office, and sat in the chair. On my finger, the 3-carat diamond ring caught the light, its brilliance restored. The courier from Dallas had arrived just as the Uber turned onto the street. The ring's light was the only inheritance I needed. I had successfully restructured my family. I was no longer the bank, the fixer, or the sacrificial lamb. I was the landlord. Looking back now, I realized that the fantasy of reality is simply having the courage to live without the masks. Engle opened her laptop one last time to confirm the final legal maneuver with Silas. The quiet power had worked because it was built on a foundation of facts, not feelings. I hadn't lost my family. I had simply forced them to become a real one, grounded in the reality of what they could actually earn and sustain. The sun began to rise over the woodlands, the sky turning a soft, bruised purple before the gold broke through. I stepped out onto the balcony with a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cool morning air. I looked out at the Texas horizon, finally free from the terminal bait that had nearly drowned me. I didn't leave my family to find myself. I found myself so I could finally stay on my own terms. My name, Engle Bertha, felt like it belonged to me again. I took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness and the warmth perfectly balanced, much like my life.